Chapter 14, For a Heart. Elder Tala Algula. Women could do a lot to change a man. Tens of moon turns ago, I never thought that I would be the puppet dangling at the end of the strings while some woman's hand manipulated me from above. It had been a long time since I escaped Nivedon, and the journey had led me to dangerous places. During the night, when sleep befell me, I would wake up panting after dreaming of those eyes that peered at me. Upon waking, I would realize that strong as my power was, Nivens terrified me. It was not right for the gods to give the gift of invisibility to anyone, let alone to an entire province. The emperor must have scared them, otherwise, why would they shroud themselves with such secrecy? Why would they play at being ghosts when they could have easily come crashing into the Canellan palace gates, and no one would ever know they were there? At least not until the ghosts start to slit the soldiers' necks. And even then, it would be dangerous for the soldiers without the gift of invisibility to fight back because they would be staring at nothing but air. Now I understand Mayandila's obsession with uncovering the identity of the ghosts. It was a wise decision for me to have followed him. If Mayan were able to convince Nivens to join the Elders Guild in ousting the Emperor, they would pose quite a threat to the palace. Images of the war generals' faces flashed inside my head, and I wondered if all of them stood firmly behind the Emperor. Who would defect if a rebellion were to start? And who would my woman order me to kill first? I had to find a way to divide the Nivens. Convert the other half to side with the Emperor. I ran a hand over my bald head. It was probably burned now, and my tan skin would not likely return to its usual fair tone. I wondered if my trap would work. For days now, I had become more careless in covering my tracks. The distance that I was able to put between the pursuing Nivens and me had narrowed, owing to the horse I had stolen in Bullocknin Canyons. If I dallied a few more days, the Nivens would catch up with me. I longed for that time to come. I realized that fighting Nivens from a distance was not the way to go because I would never have a clue where they were. But face to face, then I would stand a chance. I pulled the reins holding my bay and climbed down. The water from the spring seemed very inviting. I walked over to it and led the horse, sure that it was as thirsty as I was. The horse drank greedily, and I followed suit. When the horse had its fill, I pulled at its reins and tied its rope to a tree. I may not be able to pass by another good water source, and this spot was suitable for a bath. I undressed and folded my clothes, intent on washing them after taking a bath. My hands searched for the letters, and I took extra care not to wrinkle them. If my plan were to work, these letters would have to reach their intended recipients. I could not deliver them because my goal had changed. I needed to divide the Nivens. By doing that, I would be able to please my woman. I didn't realize that I had fallen asleep. When I woke up, I was lying near the spring with only the leaves to cover my body. My clothes had been hung out to dry. A dozen spears were pointed at my body. Instead of throwing the Nivens off using Distantecus, I smiled smugly. "Don't move," a voice yelled. "Or else you will find yourself dead." I raised my hands, and instantly, 2 spears moved and pierced my palms, pinning my hands against the ground. The pain traveled up my arms, and I grimaced. I had to bite my tongue to keep myself from groaning to their satisfaction. "One more move, and you will find yourself facing your ancestors," the same voice said. I heard some spiteful spitting. I stared at the other spears pointed towards me. "I will not fight," I said. "Show yourselves." A tall man appeared in front of me. The men holding the spears appeared from thin air one by one. "It's been a long flight, and it's high time we capture you," the man said. If the pain in my palms were not so searing, I would have spat out that they did not stand a chance at catching me if I did not want to be captured. But I knew that if I said those words, my plan would never work. "Bind him," the man said. "There's no need for that," I said, hoping that I could play my cards right. "I will go with you to your chief hunter so that I can face my punishment." They all looked confused except for the man who seemed to be their leader. "And why would you go with us willingly?" he asked harshly, spitting over my face. "You destroyed a household. You caused havoc in our town. What changed?" The Akean Wine Festival, I said. The man was taken aback. The festival? The one that killed thousands of Akeans. All because of the Emperor's wrath, I said slowly, intently watching the man's face. I can no longer support a man who vows to protect Akean at one instance and yet massacres his people without mercy at another. Confusion touched the edges of his eyes, and I could see that my plan had a chance of working out well. Bless the gods for the wisdom they gave me. I don't believe you, he yelled at me. An incident doesn't change a man that easily. You are a traitor if you come with us willingly. I laughed at him. My dear friend, or brother, if you will. Loyalty can be measured, faith can waver. And I am only a man. The Niven kicked me in the face, and my head swung to the left. Bind him and tie him to his horse. We will start the journey back to Niveton, the man said coldly. I wondered if it occurred to him to cover me with my clothes. And if my letters, which were secretly stitched to my cloak, would ever find their destinations.
Saul Douglas. The soldiers guarding Wynn's door were eyeing me warily. They remained unflinching from the entrance, not letting me pass, so I used my power on them to make them calm before I spoke. The Emperor will see me, I said. Now. The two soldiers glanced at each other before stepping sideways. I wondered what Wynn could be doing. He had kept to himself for far too long. Has the Emperor eaten? I asked. The servants that go inside the room all come scurrying out, the soldier said. We have no knowledge of his condition except that he is alive, my lady. Worry filled my chest. The man behind the Emperor is, someone I gave my heart to. He could have changed a lot, but it did not mean that my love for him drained away with the change. Open the door now, I ordered. The soldiers obeyed and pushed the doors wide open. A rancid smell entered my nose. It smelled of decay and sweat. I walked slowly inside, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. Shut the door. Wynn's voice hollered. The soldiers shoved the doors, and I was left alone with Wind. My gaze searched for him, but I could not find where he was. Then, the air tightened around me, and I was lifted from the ground. Wind, I said. Don't. But he would not stop. He pushed the windows open with air, and they swung. Bright lights flooded the room, and I raised my arms to cover my eyes. What are you doing here? He hissed. Then he pushed me outside the window with nothing but air holding me. Outside, the palace soldiers milled around. I made no sound to avoid anyone from seeing what was happening. I could control Wind. Wind, I said one more time. This time, I used my power on him and fed peace into his heart. Bring me down. Next to you? For a moment, the air holding me loosened, and I gasped as I slid in the air for more than 2 yards. I swallowed when, finally, he brought me inside. Relief flooded my chest. Wind did not release me. Instead, he carried me, air binding my waist, to where he was. With the midday light seeping through the windows, I could see him now. His hair was all disheveled, his body had loosened where muscles used to be. The sternness in his eyes remained, though. They were angry, and yet, there was something in them that reminded me of the Wind I first met tens of moon turns ago. Back when he was so much younger. When he was only a grape picker's son. You have to get out of this room, I said. He shook his head vehemently. I can't. There was a touch of softness in his voice. An uncertainty that I could not define, and my heart went to him. After all these moon turns, he still held me captive. I walked over to where he was sitting. He was slouched against a giant chair. I touched his arm upon reaching him. I gave him peace, a taste of calmness, and his countenance changed. He looked up at me with tired eyes. What went wrong, Saul? He asked. I don't know, my heart. I hoped that referring to him using the endearment we addressed each other with would make the conversation easier. What's going on outside? He asked. His shoulders tensed again. I ached to see Wind like this because I still love him. I grabbed a chair, pulled it closer to him, and ran a hand over his ruffled hair to straighten some of the silvery streaks. What's happened can no longer be changed. It is now time to face your people, I paused. Wasn't that what you always wanted? To be the source of strength for them? To be the formidable leader that Akeans needed? I failed my people. He stopped, then shook his head. What was it with the boy? I asked. It had been a wonder to me why he ordered a boy to die. And why, for no good reason at all, we went on pursuing Lamare. The boy will kill me, he said simply. He will take my empire. If he had not looked so serious when he said it, I would have laughed. How in the world will a boy take his empire? You have the war generals to your side. The palace is united. There's no need to fear a boy, I said. His power was unleashed. I don't know what you mean. But he is still just a boy, I said. All of a sudden, Wind flew into a rage. He stood up and flung the table across the room. What happened to Charisthea? Did the volcanoes erupt? He seethed. What? No. There was no news about that, I said, confused. It couldn't have been. The stupid woman's death put an end to her words. Wind, I don't understand. You don't. You won't. Because it was never your business. You were not meant to stay with me. Go away. Let me be. I made a vow long ago and asked a general to utter my words to the late Emperor Northsum Mendel Amerk. I promise to serve the Emperor as long as your life is spared. And I am a woman of my word. I don't want you here. This was hurting so much. All my life, I have dedicated my services to this man. What news is there? What else have you got to tell me? Is there no good news in Canella anymore? Thousands have died. Children, old citizens, animals, crops. Everything that was within a mile from you during the festival ended either dead or injured. I paused. I'm afraid I have no good news. To that, he laughed maniacally. They all deserve to die. For planning behind my back. For releasing the boy's power. He paused, turned to me, and said, Lamare is dead. I stared at his narrowed eyes. Those silver eyes were now red-rimmed. Perhaps he wanted me to remember Lamare, who had always been a puzzle to me. She was someone I was never able to figure out until that time that Wind and I came after her, and I learned that she used to be Wind's wife. But if that were real, how was it that I have no memory of her aside from her serving as a royal scribe? Was she erased from my memory? It must have been some power that had tricked me into believing she was nobody. Would I ever find out the entire story? You have to come out, Wind. You have to face the people. Since the festival, how many times have you met the generals? I asked. Once? Twice? Only once, he answered. An event which was so horrible and ended with me sending them all away, he shouted. They can all defect for all I care. That is not the way an emperor should think, I said, closing my eyes and passing on calmness to him. He had to see some sense in his actions. I walked over to him, rested both my hands against his chest to calm him. Then I gazed up at his lonely eyes that looked at me as though they still belonged to that lad from many moon turns ago. You are a good leader. You will do well again, I whispered. Then I glanced at the red robe that was lying on the floor. I bent to pick it up and slowly eased it over his shoulders. You are the emperor. Let no one else think otherwise. You are who you are. You always have been. And you have my unwavering support. It is time for you to return to us. He stared at me with blank eyes. I continued, people will always look up to you for support. What's been done is over. Gather yourself and rule the land like before. There's no other way but to do that. He paused, searching for words. Without Lamare, my power has no good backing. Will he ever tell me what his connection to Lamare was? What was her power? You have me. And there's someone else I sent to rally people behind you, I said, wondering when Elder Tala would send his news to me. Now is a good time to start convening the generals. Give them your orders. Make them work behind you. And the people will forget? The people will never forget. All emperors before you had their slip-ups, but it didn't stop people from supporting them. Show the citizens what you're truly made of. That you are the strength they need. That you will bring Akean to greater heights. That you are the rightful emperor, I said. At this point, I embraced him, my heart beating against his chest. Then I touched the messy hair that covered his ears and whispered in the most intimate voice I could harness, forget about the boy. His body relaxed. For that, I was thankful. His arms wrapped me in a tight embrace, and he was once again mine. We stared into each other's eyes, and he seemingly understood. My job here was done. I had brought him back to life, and as I vowed in the past, I would never leave his side. "I'm sorry, Saul," he whispered in a voice that reminded me of the lad from many moon turns ago. The gentle, fragile, loving lad. "I don't want to hurt you," he said. I gave him a smile before snuggling closer to his chest. I felt his chest harden, his muscles tensing. He released air, and from the window, I could see lightning tearing at the sky like fireworks. The crowd outside shrieked. The booming thunder followed. I pressed myself closer to Wind, and he held me on my waist. We were lifted up into the air, but this time, we were not stepping on a cloud, and I could only surmise his power had grown even stronger. He released air quickly, and all around me, the furniture flew. Chairs, tables, bookcases, and footstools all swirled around us slowly before gathering speed until I could no longer discern the separate pieces from each other: the bed, the chairs, the chandeliers. The walls of the palace shook. The air surged, and I felt like drowning. I wondered if the lower floors of the palace felt the tremor, but up here, at the highest level, the walls shook. I looked up at Wind's calm face. His eyes were shut tightly. Even with all the worries he had, Wind still looked regal. His rugged face was still domineering. Authority reeked from every pore of his face, and I will be forever mesmerized. I clutched tightly at his body, waiting for what he was about to do. The walls of the top floor of the palace that were covering us shook and burst. There was a loud explosion as the walls flew and crumbled. Bright lights hit us. It took me a moment before I opened my eyes. Wind released me, and I dropped to the floor. He glided in the air until he was near the edge, and everybody could see him. I ran after him, stopping only when there were no floors to step on. He looked at the faces of the Akeans. "Akeans, we will rise," he shouted. The audience was stunned to see the Canellan Palace's top floor exploding before their very eyes. Amazed to see the man who made that happen, stunned to see the Emperor once more. One by one, the audience knelt. Some began shouting, crying to the Emperor. My eyes watered. The man's power was unleashed again. I prayed that this time, he would do good to Akean. To the Emperor. The chants kept on. Long live the Emperor. I prayed that the crowd really did forgive. Wind threw his arms upwards at the sky. The land had been so dry, and the crops had died without rain. Famine had grown uncontrollably since the festival. And this time, the clouds darkened until the rain started to pour. One by one, the Akeans stood up, and the cheers only grew louder. There was dancing outside, a sign of gratitude to their emperor for bringing the gift from the gods. I looked down at all of them, wondering how many were doing this for show and how many were planning to plant a dagger at the emperor's back. The emperor's horrible deeds would not be forgotten this easily. That was when I started to worry, because no open opposition to Wind's rule only meant that our enemies were all in hiding, waiting for the moment to retaliate. Look for Taran Ariger. Tell him to meet me in the chambers. I nodded in understanding. The road had finally opened, and I hoped that we were again back on track. One more thing, though. Go to your mother, I said. Wind's head jerked upwards, and his eyes were angry in an instant. Do not speak to me about that woman. He spat out. You need allies who you know will not defect from you. Aside from me, how many among your war generals do you really have on a leash? Wind looked away. He shut his eyes tightly, the corners of his eyes showing off some faint lines. Then send word to Marcella Benilda. I will pay her a visit, he said coldly. Sometimes he listens. Yes, sometimes he does. Marcella Benilda. Do it again, I told my maidservant in an irritated tone. She curtsied and, with shaking fingers, untied my hair. My long, dark locks fell across the length of my back, and I stared at myself in the mirror in front of me. Lines gathered at the edges of my eyes, but my face was still uncorrupted by age. Nothing could go wrong today. Nothing, I kept on telling myself. After all these years, I will finally meet my son. I invited him to the Amaretian Palace too many times, but it was only now that he accepted. The note that was sent to me was written in graceful scripts, with each letter ending with a loop. I knew that this was not my son's handwriting. I had hoped that he would write to me personally, but then again, maybe I did not deserve that much attention from him. His Royal Highness wishes to inform you that he will visit you in Ameresian Palace. Expect His Grace to arrive before nightfall. All of this left me jittery. What would I tell him? Did he still hate me? Could I find a way into his heart? I would do anything for a smile. The maidservant tugged at my hair, and my head jerked backward. Careful, or you will find yourself out on the streets, I hissed. She was new to the Ameresian Palace, and she was yet to be accustomed to my ways. It was unfortunate that my former hairdresser had been one of the thousands to die at the Akean Wine Festival. A regrettable event. And now, I had to make do with this young girl who was not as familiar with arranging hair. Then I gasped as I stared again in the mirror. My hair was finished. It was raised on a bun at just the right angle. Some locks were hanging and looping right below my ears that gave off a dramatic effect. This girl was an excellent hairdresser, after all. I closed my mouth to hide my surprise. "You've been doing this a long time, girl?" I asked. "Yes, Your Highness," she answered. "Since when?" "3 moon turns ago, Your Highness." I frowned. She was much too young to have been working for 3 moon turns, but labor was hard to come by, and citizens needed to earn a living. "I will work on your face now, Your Highness," she said. Then she moved right in front of me. I closed my eyes and relaxed, but my heart continued to beat rapidly. I wished it were tomorrow. That way, this day would be over, I would have known how my meeting with Wind would end, and I could sleep again in peace. My son has finally acknowledged my presence, and that was enough to put me in a better mood. The moons were glowing while the sun was beginning to shy away from us. Still, I stood waiting outside the palace gates. All around me, my people were wearing their best clothes. A touch of red grazed their gowns and dress shirts to represent the Benilde house. I could see from their faces that they were either eager or afraid. If any of them was irritated, they did a good job hiding it. There was still no sign of my son. "Your Highness," Lara Sendo said. "We've been waiting for almost half a day. Are you certain he's coming?" What was I to say? If the Emperor were not to come as promised, it would cause a lot of uncertainty in Amer. It would send the signal that he did not support my house. His own mother's house. "He will come," I said sternly. Laras gazed at the far end of the court, awaiting any movement the gate guards would make to indicate that someone was outside and that someone had arrived. But his eyes only narrowed as he watched the stillness of the guards. "Your Highness, let me escort you inside. Standing out here is not doing you any good. As soon as the Emperor's soldiers arrive, I will fetch you," he urged. "Nonsense. I will stay here and wait," I said. "I have waited for a long time. What does it matter if my son makes me wait for another hour or 2? Nobody, though, not even Laras, would understand why a queen had to wait." Laras's jaw hardened, and I felt sorry for him. This young man was just doing his job, which was primarily to protect me. His face had a hard edge which the ladies in the palace found attractive. He was also good with the sword. What brought me closer to him, though, was his power. I had a pretty good use for that. "If you say so, my queen," he said with an edge to his tone that was almost defiant. My gaze was torn away from his face when the crowd began to stir. Up above, I saw my son riding a sea of clouds. He stood to the front, uncaring whether or not a rebel could be present among my people. He was brave and foolish, and for that, I beamed proudly as only a mother would. The clouds finally touched the ground, and the mist thinned, revealing 100 soldiers escorting him. My son must have developed a fondness for such ostentatious displays. I was torn between kneeling in front of him or rushing over and embracing him tightly. My boy, whom I had missed forever and whom I had not thought of reuniting with in this lifetime, was standing right in front of me. If my people were not here, I would have shed tears and begged for his forgiveness. And probably tried to make him understand what had happened before between us. Why did I have to leave the way I did? Why did he have to grow up without a mother? All the whys of our past, but the Queen's actions were closely watched, and I could not falter. I could feel Laras's glare from behind me. He knew about Wind and who he was in my life. Laras knew why I sent him every now and then to the Canellan Palace. Why I had him report to me everything he learned about the young emperor, and why I had asked him to use his power on some of the men across the land. Wind did not flinch from where he landed. The soldiers around him stood ready, as evidenced by their tense shoulders and set jaws. My eyes searched his face for any hint of softness, but it was either he was still far away from me, or there was no room for tenderness in his heart for his mother. For what I did, who could blame him? His red robes danced as he strode forward. He stopped when he was an arm's length away. Tears filled my eyes no matter how hard I tried to hide my emotions. He was staring at me. His eyes were a perfect reflection of mine. Gray eyes met gray eyes, and the coldness seeped from his stare into mine. But I met his stare with the remorse I had been feeling ever since I left him. I swallowed and spoke, "The Emperor's presence humbles me, Your Grace." His expression did not change. I knelt and looked up at the face that was my son's. All around me, my people knelt down, for no one among them could stand higher than their queen. "Stand up," he said. Then in a thick voice, he added, "Woman." Shock filled me. It was humiliating to be addressed as woman in front of my people. I stood up on wobbly knees, and when Laros moved beside me to help me, I swatted his hand. This moment was for my son and me alone. Then I smiled at the Emperor and waited for him to return it. He did not. There was no trace of affection that I could read from his eyes. This man, this hard man in front of me, became who he was because of me. The roughness and the toughened exterior were all because of my doing. And I could not decide if I wanted him like this. As a mother, my heart ached for the hardships that my son had to go through, and on impulse, I jumped at him and clutched at his body. There was no room to think twice about it. This was my son. My only son. The courtyard was filled with the sounds of unsheathed swords. The men who came with Wind surrounded me, their swords pointed at my body. Laros was not a slow man. He was immediately right behind the Emperor, his sword drawn against my son's head. I was still holding Wind. If I died here holding him, then all of the waiting would be worth it, but my son had other things on his mind. He pulled back from my grip and laughed. Then he faced Laros. "Did you think that I am afraid of your sword?" Wind spat out. "Only a fool would think that." Wind lifted Laros's body in the air. Laros's hand that held the sword was bent backward by an invisible force, and his grip on the sword loosened, sending a loud clanging sound across the stillness of the courtyard. No one stirred. Even the air stiffened, and I grew scared. I pulled away from Wind, my gaze not leaving his face. "Put your swords down," I commanded. Wind stared at me, his eyes measuring mine. He may be the Emperor, but I was still his mother. If there were a chance for us to reconcile, he would support me this instant. "There is no reason for this chaos," Wind said. "Put your arms on the ground. A mayor has always stood behind the Canellan palace. We will dine without swords and armor." The men from Canella were the first ones to obey. Their armors were removed, and their swords began to litter the ground. Laros followed suit, albeit reluctantly. Against the darkening sky, the Amaretian courtyard sparkled with the metal that reflected the waning light. "Come, Amaretian Queen," Wind said. "There is something we need to discuss." His eyes rolled upwards as he said those words, and it scared me. He closed his eyes, his jaw hardened. I stood frozen. Was being addressed as Amaretian Queen better than being called woman? Should I remind him that he is also of Amaretian blood? When I still did not stir, he said, "Woman, walk with me." I extended my hand to him, which he all but thumped before pushing it away. When Wind started walking towards the palace, my men parted to give way. I followed him. Wind slowed down until I was walking beside him. "Never touch me again," he said, seething. I looked at him, but he did not meet my gaze. He walked ahead of me as though he was the ruler of a mare and I was the visitor. But he was my son, and he was the Emperor. By both accounts, he had a right to rule this land. Somewhere from my back, I heard the sounds of gritting teeth. Laros was walking a few paces behind me.
McQuinn Storm Aaron. Marcella Benilda, the Queen of Amer, had taken to her chambers. And here I am in a room that was probably bigger than hers. She said that this was her father's, my grandfather's, room and that it would not be right for her to take it. No one but anyone higher than her father could use this room. When she said that, she had studied me from head to toe as though measuring me if I was worthy. I could not sleep. Nighttime used to be my companion, a sifter of my muffled thoughts, but tonight, perhaps knowing that my mother was with me in the same place made me uncomfortable. There were many questions I needed her to answer for me. Why did she leave my father and me? Why did she have to go? Why? There was a gnawing pain in my chest, and I had to obliterate it before I found myself exploding again. My ears had started to throb, and I could feel them burning. Breathe easy, I told myself. If only Saul were here, she would have been able to control my emotions, and I would not have to struggle so much. But when Saul learned that I would be traveling to Amer riding the clouds, she refused. I did not ask her again because I understood her hesitation. She was a good woman, and Lamare's death still bothered her. Saul promised to follow me here, though. It could take her 7 days if she were to travel in a carriage. 5 if she and the soldiers who would be coming with her were to ride the horses hard. I tossed in bed and clutched the blanket closer to me. The weather was damp, but there was a certain hollowness in me that I thought needed covering up with the blanket. Lamare tricked me. Up until now, I still could not believe that I could be so preoccupied with other matters that I would fall prey to her trick. A trick that cost Lamare her life and could cost me my empire. I could not recall everything that Lamare wrote in her last scroll. There were bits and pieces about a wage increase, to which I had objected. The volcanoes were going to erupt. What happened to all of that? It made me feel deeply insecure that the last manipulation of the events to come was lost to me. Everything she wrote should have happened in a fortnight, and yet, the days had passed by, and none of the events she wrote about materialized. What should I do now that Lamare is gone? How could I be sure that I would be able to hold Akean forever? All rules come to an end, and that was what I was trying to avoid. The time that Northsome talked to me about foresight, I have tried to do anything within my power to change the future. Because the future, if the vision that I had seen was accurate, was catastrophic, for me. And now, what could I do to ensure that my power would remain? I counted the days inside my head. Turan Aragor executed my instructions earlier today. He had sent word to every general to meet me in a fortnight. Ride hard. The Emperor summons you, was what the communique had said. Saul was right. I had kept to myself for a long time, and this could quite possibly appear as a weakness on my side. I needed to meet the generals and show them that what happened at the festival was a ploy. For what? I sat up and buried my face in my hands. How would I explain it to them? Nobody knew about Micromanya's prophecy. Nobody knew about Lamare and me. That she betrayed me when I was still her husband. And that in her demise, the blow was greater to me than it ever was to anyone who knew her. To that, I laughed. Nobody knew her. Nobody remembered her, except for her boy, the product of her betrayal. I squeezed my eyes shut again and clutched at my head. Keeping her alive for so long had been a mistake. Letting the boy live was a mistake, too, a side effect of a wrong decision. Now, I had to deploy people I trusted to kill the boy. However, the dilemma was that not even my most trusted general would execute the order willingly. The generals would obey me, there was no question about that. But it did not mean that they would not remember an order given without any explanation. If it were a man of age being pursued, my order could go unquestioned. But the one I wanted dead was a boy. So maybe I could capture him. Put him behind bars. Wait for the moment that he could fight me and challenge him to a duel. That way, I would not be shamed. I was disturbed by several knocks on my door. I looked up and shouted, "Go away, whoever you are. I did not summon you." The knock did not come again, but after a few seconds, I heard the voice of someone I did not know I had always kept in the back of my mind. "It is I," she said. I gritted my teeth. There was nothing to speak about. It had taken all my courage not to hit her upon seeing her. But to be alone with her? I never want my restraint to be tested. "Go away." "All the more reason that I should send you away," I said. In the darkness, a trickle of light seeped as the door opened slightly. It fully opened until the silhouette of the woman I had longed to see when I was much younger stood framed by the door. "Who allowed you to come here? Where are my soldiers?" I snarled. She glided towards me in steps that were so graceful. "Dear wind, you keep on forgetting. Your mother is not the lowly housewife you remembered from long ago," she said in a cooing voice. She closed the door behind her. My eyes adjusted to the darkness. This must be how my people perceived me. In the dark, her eyes shone like silver pools, piercing and intimidating. If she had shown deference to me earlier, all traces were gone now. I remembered a good mother. "What did you know?" she asked. Red veiled my eyes. "What you allowed me to know. You left. I paused. "You left us. You left me." She stood right in front of me. "That was the only way this could happen," she said. "What are you saying?" "This. The Empire. If I had not done what I did, you wouldn't be an emperor now." I stood up from the four-poster bed and strode towards her. This woman was all but claiming credit for my holding the throne. Patience was a virtue I am unfamiliar with, and my blood boiled in rage. "How dare you?" I said. "How dare you take credit for what I worked for all my life? When you were here in the palace surrounded by your servants, did you ever stop to think about us? Did you ever once consider coming back to my father? To your boy? Tell me, Mama," I paused. "Did you ever think about me?" It seemed like so long ago, and yet, all the hatred that built up inside my chest remained. I could fool myself into acting civilly towards the Queen, but I could not make myself believe that I no longer loathed Marcella Benilde, the woman who left me. Her eyes glanced at me, the fierceness gone, and all I saw in them was the tenderness of that time when I was only 8 moon turns old. When I saw her lying on the floor inside my room with broken pieces of hard clay shattered around her, I was afraid that she had hurt herself. That she had been lost to me forever. So, I woke her up, and when she would not stir, I went to fetch Papa from the vineyard. I never thought that upon waking, my mother would hurt me even more by leaving. Had I known, I would have let her lie there on the floor for the maggots to eat. I shivered despite the dampness of my room. Memories make a man weak. "I cannot blame you for how you feel about me. No words would ever be good enough to explain what happened," she said. "But I'm back now. Let me help you. You have enemies. Plots are rising all around you. Don't tell me that you've turned a blind eye to the opposition? That is the reason I came here and not the reunion you were hoping to have." She blanched. Better I hurt her in the same way she hurt me. "You have nothing to fear about that," she said. Her voice had taken an edge, and it almost made me want to kneel before her and beg her to love me again. For her to love her boy again. Instead, I met her glare. She was hurt that I doubted her allegiance. I would hurt her more by being indifferent. "Make me trust you again," I said. She blinked, and her mouth thinned. "I am gathering support from all over the land. I will send you a word once I hear from my sources." I nodded curtly. "I need you to find the boy." She pursed her lips and walked slowly towards a chair. I followed her. "Will you light this lamp?" she said. I looked at the oil lamp, pointed my forefinger at the wick, and flicked. A small charge of lightning emitted from the tip of my finger, and the lamp started to burn. The flame danced, and it drew shadows across my mother's face. A smile graced her lips, making me believe that she was proud of my power. "Who is the boy?" she asked. I took the chair beside her. "He is my nemesis." A burst of delighted laughter escaped my mother's lips. "Your nemesis? It doesn't seem like that to me. This boy is the one who could overthrow me. There was a prophecy. Something." I stopped, not meaning to share what I knew with the woman in front of me. "A prophecy, you say? Forget it. Look for the boy, and I will forgive you." After a while, I added, "Perhaps." She stared at me for a long time. "He is not the one who will kill you," she said. I stared at her, trying to measure if she was kidding. What do you know of these things? I seethed. My power gives me warnings. A sense of what will happen in the future. It isn't always, she paused before shaking her head, accurate. But it gives me a prediction. Like a prophecy, I said. Almost. What was it you saw? A swordsman will behead you. A swordsman? All my soldiers wield the sword. All the other houses' soldiers wield the sword. Did you think that I would believe you? A swordsman could be anyone. Even the peddlers could grab a sword from their family's heirlooms and use it against me. What you've offered me has no value at all. I can find him, she said. When I do, I will kill him to stop him from killing you. I laughed, and to anyone within earshot, I would surmise that they would think I was crazy. You will leave me without any soldiers then? Be careful, because with what you're planning to do, you could end up with only the slaves surrounding you. I continued laughing. Her eyes glinted dangerously. They tore down the cold walls I put between us. This is no laughing matter. It is not appropriate that you find this so amusing. And what do you expect from the Emperor? I said. To send his people to throw daggers at every swordsman to keep himself alive? You are crazy. There are many things even the Emperor does not, will not, understand, she started. Other citizens' powers may not be as strong as yours, but theirs are equally important. It never was in the power one possesses but in how the wielder chooses to use it. I see you've used yours as a shield against hatred. When will you use it to conquer? You talk of understanding as though you're one who understands it. As though you're easy to understand. But that's where you got it wrong, I leered. Do you want to hear what I believe in? She stared at me with widened eyes. Hatred, I said. Hatred makes my power grow. Hate makes me unbeatable. You see this? I asked as I enveloped her with a fistful of air. Her body rose, and when her feet no longer touched the floor, her arms flailed at her sides as I strangled her. Then I released her, and she fell to the floor with a sickening thud. Before me, the Queen of Amer lay helplessly. It did not give me satisfaction, though, because when she looked up at me, I saw no tears in her eyes. Hate makes me this strong, I said softly. You're wrong, she said. It makes you weak. A moment ago, you were not controlling your power. It was controlling you. And now I see why you have developed enemies within your own yard. Get out, I answered sternly. I did not need a lecture from her. This isn't over, Wind, she said as she stood. Get away from me, I said. I don't need you anymore. I'm no longer your little boy. She walked towards me. Then she curtsied before leaving me alone in the room. I sensed my own remorse, but I could not feel affection. As soon as she was out, I shoved the door with air. The hinges creaked and gave way, sending the door a few yards away from its frame. From where I was standing, I could see the silhouette of a woman who hesitated momentarily before turning away and leaving me. Again. There would be no rest for tonight as rage fed the hollowness inside my chest. Elder Tala Algula. We had been traveling for days, and I could already smell how badly I reeked. These Nivens did not care for me at all. The last bath I had taken seemed too long ago, and my white robes were greasy and torn. At least they had the decency to let me put them back on. My hands were bound behind my back, but my fingers were loose. Had I wanted to escape, I could have. If only I were good with words, maybe I would have finished my task. Romeo, I said. When will we arrive at the ghost town? He didn't look at me. Shut up. He was a hard one to break. He would not even talk to me. If my sense is right, we could have been there, but you keep on sidling along unconquered paths. I laughed. What are you afraid to find when we get back to the middle of the mountains? That you no longer have the community of hiders? He turned around and did not relent. He punched me hard across my cheek. It stung, but it was worth it. Better to be hurt than to go unnoticed. You will keep your mouth shut, he sneered. You will have your word with the chief hunter. Not with me or any other. He pulled away so quickly that I almost admired the grace of these Nivens. They moved fluidly as though every movement was a dance step. Why there? Why not here? Why with him and not with you? I shouted. Protocol. I laughed mockingly. Protocol? You are found out. What protocol are you still talking about? Once the Emperor learns about your existence, you will be eradicated from Akean. And this time, I'm afraid there will be no room for ghosts. Not anymore. Why can't you keep your mouth shut? Because I want to understand you. You said that you're going with us voluntarily. Yet you keep on taunting me. Only because you act like a child. His face hardened. You will not refer to me as one. Then think about why I call you a child. Here I am alone with your group, and not once did you try to question me. Not once did you subject me to questioning about the world when I knew everything that's going on in Akean. Don't you find this information useful? I know my place. Take a moment to ponder yours. There is no need. I know my place, and that is exactly why I'm talking to you, I said. To convince you that your place is not here. Don't fool me with words. How old are you? Far less than what my wisdom represents. I chuckled. You are the one good with words. You have nothing to fear from me. Talk to me. A wise man always welcomes information. A fool hears what has been said and forgets about it. Flattery will get you nowhere with me, he said. And yet here you are still talking to me. I raised my eyebrows at him and met his stare. Against the sunlight, I could hardly see his face. My eyes were puffed with the blows I received from Niven's hands. Blood clotted the corners of my eyes. How long has it been? He avoided my eyes. I was young when it happened. My people were practicing for the festival. We were perfecting the moon steps. I heard about the moon steps but never got the chance to see the Nivens perform it. It was a famous dance, one where citizens who saw it claimed that it was like watching people fly even though their feet touched the ground. All at once, dark clouds covered the sky. Trees were hurled all over Nivedon. Half of Nivedon was destroyed. No other living creature thrived. And that was before the storm started, Romeo said. Ironically, with his claim of not wanting to talk to me, he slumped to the ground and continued speaking. I was barely grown to a man's chest. I didn't understand what was happening except that the rain came in torrents. The elders found shelter for us, and we waited for the rain to stop. But it never did. Soon enough, the water rose, and we went scrambling to the trees. My friends climbed up to where we were sheltering, but a bolt of lightning splintered the tree. I was a coward then. Upon seeing my friends' burning bodies, I grabbed the vine closest to me and started swinging from one vine to the next until my hands were raw. I ended up in the outskirts of a mare, barely alive, as I watched the smoke trail to the sky as though it was a beacon that none of my people survived. Romeo's gray face twisted in pain. I let him continue speaking. When it was over, I made myself invisible. And I used the moon steps to glide back to the province discreetly. When I reached Nivedon, my people were nowhere to be found. Bodies lay everywhere. Dead, burned, and decaying. What did we do to make the Emperor so mad? He asked me. How can you be sure it was the Emperor's doing? Only he has the power to do that, he answered. I looked for my people until I found them somewhere in the deepest part of Nivedon huddled like lost children. Everyone was accounting for their dead, he said, shaking his head. You wouldn't believe the sounds I heard there. The wailing was unimaginable, like it was coming from beneath the ground. Their cries left me sleepless for weeks. There is always a reason, I said. A reason to kill people? He yelled. A reason to ravish all of us who remained loyal to him for all the moon turns that passed? Do you believe in prophecies? I prefer not to. Micromania prophesied that out of Niven blood, Akean would rise again. He stopped clenching his fist and glared at me. Micromania? And that's why we were destroyed? The great woman seer, She was a counselor to Northsome Mendel Emmerich. How did you know all these? I smiled dryly. I am an elder. I know the world more than you could ever fathom. I paused before continuing. Northsome was a great emperor. He was able to find her, his daughter, a good consort, I said before I stopped short. Daughter? How come I could barely remember a daughter or a princess of any sort? Romeo sensed my confusion. And? Wind was a great young man. He was excellent as far as his power was concerned, and Northsome saw the good that he could do for the land. But when Northsome asked what Micromania thought of Wind, she had only one thing to say. What? That out of Niven blood, Akean will rise again. I stopped because I did not understand the riddle either. Northsome knew he had made a mistake in marrying his daughter off to the grape picker's son. What Northsome failed to consider was that when he made Wind his daughter's consort, Northsome had begun to share his power with Wind. And his power was? Charm, I answered. That doesn't make any sense. I smiled again. How little you understand. Have you laid eyes on the Emperor? Moon turns ago, even the soldiers wanted to bet him. I laughed, shaking my head at the notion. With charm, even Micromania couldn't resist Wind, and she disclosed what was supposedly a sacred prophecy. Why are you telling me all this? To make you understand. I trust only the words of my clan. Then you are not the wise man I thought you were. He sneered. And you are the lamest of liars in Akean. I'm not lying. So, the Emperor, if I were to take your account as true, is not. He's acting to protect what's his. I smiled sincerely this time. Exactly. Like what you're doing now. We are different. Different goals, but the way you both act is certainly similar. You remind me of a younger version of him. Cold and detached, angry at the world. And yet, if only your eyes were open to the truth, you would choose to side with the right faction. I thought you wanted to go to Niveton? I know your people's story. What is there left for me to unravel? Then you lie. Again and again and again. Makes me a terrible mentor, doesn't it? He shook his head. You want me to side with the Emperor? He said, his gray face losing blood. Don't we all want to side with the ruler? With the one who has the most power? I am not a traitor. My clan believes in our tenets. We survive in the way the tenets dictate. We do not break apart at the slightest challenge. Mountains will be flattened, but the Nivens will all rise to bring them up again if only to keep ourselves barricaded from the outside world, he said coldly. His voice shook with rage. I decided it best not to respond to that. At least he had gotten to thinking. He left without another word. After a few minutes, I was pulled from where I was sitting and strapped against the horse, lying flatly against the horse's back. The light blinded me from above, and it was a terrible position for me to be in, but patience was what it would take to win against these Nivens. I would be able to convince Romeo and his entourage to go with me to Canellan Palace in time, and my letters would find their way soon enough to their intended recipients.